1. I'm pressing the start button now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of the attention-based training program. It's hard to believe that we're already over halfway there now, and I hope you've been enjoying the course so far. As I said last week, the further we go through the course, the shorter the sessions are going to be, because normally this would be more about individuals talking to me as opposed to me talking to you. It should be more about your practice at this point. But nevertheless, we'll still have at least a half an hour to discuss the topic of today, which is compassion, and we'll go through that in a minute. So I just want to have a brief recap of last week to see how you went. I want you to really answer these questions in your mind, or maybe after the session today if you haven't thought about them since. So you might remember that last week we discussed the twin arrows of suffering, so primary and secondary pain, and how primary pain was generally unavoidable, such as a chronic disease condition or something like a global pandemic, for example, that we're all going through now. Whereas we tend to add secondary pain or secondary suffering to this initial pain. And secondary suffering is entirely avoidable, especially if we use some kind of practice like attention-based training. So that was the twin arrows of suffering in primary and secondary pain. Now, in terms of evaluation and judgment, which was also a big part of last week, we really discussed how the brain is constantly judging the internal and external environments, and how if we allow it to, it can exacerbate anxiety if we're feeling it at the moment. So really what we need to do is become more aware of this judgment and to try and use our attention-based training platforms to disengage from this type of judgment. And we also discussed that a lot of this judgment, for some of us, not everybody, can be largely directed against the self. And this can be particularly insidious and corrosive over time. And we also learned that a lot of this self-criticism can come from our early childhood or early adolescence, essentially coming from what I termed and what has been termed in cognitive behavioral theory, core beliefs. So these core beliefs, which are like commandments among families or small social groups, can tend to sow the seeds that develop into a really concrete set of commandments that can lead to some types of self-judgment. They're not always bad, but can sometimes lead to self-judgment as we grow older as adults. And again, we can use the attention-based training platform to manage this kind of self-critique. So again, I'll bore you again, and I will be for the foreseeable future until the end of this course, about trying to provide some kind of platform for your training. So in other words, let's put this down on paper. Don't ignore the fact that you need a different regime for the week versus the weekend, for vacation time and for shift work. So again, if you haven't put your practice plans down on paper, I would urge you to use these templates that you'll find at the end of the manual for this week and also for the manual for week 1, which again, I'll remind you are in the folder, the attention-based training folder that you should all have access to in the OneDrive. And again, just to remind you of the core practice. So our core practice is about adopting this upright posture, again, not a rigid, but a gently upright spine, so that we don't fall asleep. And remember that this type of meditation practice is not about falling asleep or relaxation, it's actually hard work. We choose an anchor, and hopefully your anchor will be set right now, so that you will already know that you either choose the breath or a chosen phrase such as I am here now as your anchor. And this anchor is used to help us disengage from thought, from emotions, sensations and memories. On a moment by moment basis, we return to this anchor to help us disengage. So last week, hopefully you've been managing to get some practice in the morning and the evening in terms of your core practice, which was 5 minutes last week. You set the timer, engage your core anchor, you go through the minutes, you disengage moment by moment, your timer goes off and your practice is finished. So this is our core practice, as we've seen before. And I just want to remind you again that although this is the core attention-based training practice that should bookend your day in terms of the morning and evening time, and we add on minutes each time as we go through the program, the 8-week program, I've also mentioned other practices, which I would term satellite practices. So we can see from this image here that the central core practice is the moment by moment disengagement from thought and emotion using an anchor. But also we have these additional satellite practices that we can use to help us under different circumstances. So up until week 5, which is where we are now, we've already discussed the body scan. So each week, in fact, we practice the body scan. And just to remind you that the body scan can be very useful in terms of preparing or grounding the mind and body if we're anxious, upset, or irritated prior to our core practice. So this can help ground the body and the mind and help us practice easier in terms of the core practice itself. It can also be used for insomnia when we're finding it difficult to sleep, for example. But the primary focus of the body scan is to make us aware of the body, but also to ground us prior to the core practice. Another practice, another satellite practice that we mentioned the last time was urge surfing, which is another type of practice that can help us surf any type of craving. So whether that's a craving to want something or not want something. So for example, to want food in terms of that type of craving, or to want pain to stop in terms of wanting something to stop like that. So again, these are satellite practices. You use these practices when and where you need them, but the core practice remains the same. And the reason why I'm bringing these satellite practices to the fore here in this illustration is because today I'm going to introduce you to another satellite practice, which revolves around cultivating compassion. So as we do every day at the start of our session, we'll engage a relatively quick body scan. Hopefully by now you won't need this to be guided, but I'm going to guide you through this each week anyway. But to remind you, we use this to help ground ourselves, to integrate the mind and the body, and really settle the mind and body prior to the core practice. So as usual, for the body scan, we adopt an upright position, feet planted on the ground, with your hands on your lap or by your side, or whatever is most comfortable. And then you can gently close your eyes. And we begin, as always, by taking a deep inhalation, a deep in-breath. And a slow exhalation. So we start by bringing our attention to the toes of the left foot. If we can, we try and get a sense of the individual toes. Bring your attention to the sole of your foot, top of your foot, your left ankle. Feel your left foot as one unit. Then slowly bring your attention from your left ankle up through your left calf muscle. Remember, we relax the muscle groups as we move. And then resting for a moment on the left knee. And from the left knee, we bring our attention to the left thigh muscle. We consciously relax this large muscle group as we move from the left knee slowly up through the thigh till we reach the left hip. And from the left hip, we move across the pelvis, down into the toes of the right foot. If we can, we try and sense individual toes. If we can't, that's okay. We bring our awareness now to the whole right foot, including the ankle, the heel, the sole of the foot, the upper part of the foot. And then we move slowly from the right ankle up through the right calf muscle, resting on the right knee. And from the right knee, we move into the right thigh muscle, relaxing this large muscle group, back and front. As we move slowly up to the right hip. From the right hip, we move around to the base of the back. And at the bottom of the back, we move slowly up either side of the spinal column, consciously relaxing the muscles as we move up slowly toward the shoulder blades. From the shoulder blades, we move into the left shoulder. This large muscle group that can be very tight sometimes, especially when we're under stress. Consciously relax this left shoulder group. And then slowly move down to the tips of the fingers of your left hand, your left thumb. Get a sense of your left hand as one unit from the tips of your fingers to your wrist. From the left wrist, we move into the upper arm, resting for a moment at the left elbow. Remember, you continue to breathe normally throughout this practice. From the left elbow, we move up into the upper left arm, relaxing the muscle as we do. Until we stop at the left shoulder again. Get a sense of the weight of your left arm as it hangs from your shoulder. And from your left shoulder, then we move across to the right shoulder. And down through the right arm until we reach the tips of the fingers of the right hand. Get a sense of your right hand as one unit. From the thumb to the wrist to the fingers. And then move from your right wrist slowly through your upper to your lower right arm, resting at your right elbow for a moment. Before we move slowly up through the upper right arm, relaxing the muscle as we do. Get a sense of your whole right arm now as it hangs from your shoulder. And from your right shoulder then, we move to the back of the neck. We relax the back of the neck. Feel the weight of the head as it's supported by the neck. And we move around to the jaw muscles left and right. Relax your jaw muscle. And then move slowly left and right, past your cheekbones, your temples left and right, your forehead. Then relax the muscles around your eyes. And from the eyes, we move around to the back of the head. And move slowly up to the top of the head and the scalp. Get a sense of your head again as one unit as it sits on your neck. And now take one final deep breath in before exhaling slowly. And then we're back in the room at the end of the body scan. So just a little summary of what we're going to go through today. Today really is all about compassion and how we can use compassion-related meditation techniques to help cultivate this kind of emotion and feeling. And we're going to look at the importance of compassion for not just the self, but for other, and also someone we might not necessarily like to give compassion toward, and that's the enemy in our lives, if indeed you have one. And we'll look very briefly at the science behind compassion. I'm not going to delve too deeply into the science of compassion. I'll provide you with links where you can read as much or as often as you like about this topic, as I will try to do with each week. And again, this information should be in the folders attached to the course. And very briefly, we'll just touch on how compassion can be an issue among healthcare professionals. And I know that some of you listening today will be healthcare professionals, and this might be useful for you to bring this type of practice into your professional working life. And the actual satellite practice that we discussed today is called loving kindness meditation, which is essentially a Buddhist meditation that can be used in many different aspects of life to help cultivate compassion. So in terms of compassion, we need to define exactly what we mean and what I mean by compassion. And sometimes compassion can be confused with empathy and vice versa. So it's important that we have some kind of agreement between us on what we believe compassion and empathy are and what the accurate definition is between us. So I'm sure you'd all agree that human beings are relatively unique, as far as we're aware anyway, of being able to develop empathy in terms of being able to imagine the states of other human beings. So whether that human being is in a state of happiness or a state of distress, human beings have evolved the capacity to try and feel what the other person or human being is feeling like. And generally we call this empathy. And by and large, empathy is good, and it's a good attribute for most humans, for all humans to have, and usually it doesn't cause an issue. However, sometimes, and for some people who are vulnerable to stress and anxiety, but also for the majority of us in a stressful scenario, such as a global pandemic, as we are at the moment, this can actually exacerbate our suffering and our anxiety, where empathy can seem to be overwhelming in terms of our feelings toward other people. So you could imagine right now that you could have empathy for friends, for family members who've lost loved ones to this disease, or you can have empathy for healthcare workers who are out in this difficult time, or for individuals in countries that don't have the adequate supplies that we do have in Ireland, for example. So there are many different reasons that we can feel empathy for other individuals, including ourselves and our loved ones in these kind of stressful global events. And this can become overwhelming at times. And as I said here in the bottom here, the distinction between the self and the other can become blurred, and this can exacerbate our stress and anxiety that we're feeling at the time. So really the solution here is to try and move from a state of empathy to a state of compassion. And it's very important for us to understand the difference between the two. Now, I'm referencing this group here, and this is a particular paper and review by Singer and Klimecki from 2014. And it's a very important research group out in the field today, and I would encourage you to read more by this group. They're very important in this field, among others. And they have defined and differentiated empathy and compassion very nicely as far as I'm concerned. And this is a quote from this review that they produced in 2014. So in other words, that the difference between compassion and empathy is that compassion is characterized by feelings of warmth and concern for others, such as is empathy. However, the difference is that compassion is a feeling for rather than a feeling with the other. So compassion, there's a slight distance between us. We still feel empathy for the individuals, but it becomes less overwhelming. So compassion is about feeling for and not feeling with the other individual, if that makes sense. And this helps empathy from becoming overwhelming us and adding to our personal anxiety. And in this particular review by Singer, they provide this very nice table, which I've taken from the reference that you can see below. And again, you can see the differences between compassion and empathy as far as they're concerned. So empathy underlies both compassion and empathic distress, but you can see here that empathy can actually emerge into empathic distress when things become overwhelming, when there is that blurring between the self and the other. And if we focus on this empathic distress, we can see that it's, self-related emotion. It's largely negative. And if this occurs over a long period of time, this contributes to what we talked about in week 2 and 3, which was the biology of stress, where we get this burnout developing over time and this chronic anxiety developing over time, which can have a lot of nasty effects if lasting longer than 6 to 8 weeks. On the other hand, if we focus on compassion, it is like empathy. It's an other related emotion, but it's largely positive when we compare it to empathic stress. And it contributes to actually good and positive health. And it's usually associated with action as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. So hopefully you can get an understanding then of what we're talking about when we're looking at compassion versus empathy, and especially overwhelming empathy that can lead to distress. So one is positive, where the other can lead to negative emotions and distress over time. So how do we cultivate this compassion if it's more positive than overwhelming or distressing empathy? So you might remember that at the very start in week 1, we talked about the fact that there are 3 basic different types of meditation practices. Now, obviously, there are hundreds and thousands of meditation practices, but by and large, we'll find that they fall into these 3 distinct groups. So we have the mindful cohort of meditation practices. We have the attention and focus based, which is largely what we talk about in this course. And then we have the compassion-oriented ones, the gratitude-oriented ones. And the example I'm going to give you today is loving kindness meditation. So that's really what we're focusing on today. Again, this is a satellite practice that revolves around your core practice, which is attention-based training. And I want to introduce loving kindness meditation to you today as a way to cultivate compassion as opposed to overwhelming empathy that can cause distress over time. So this is just a very basic description of the meditation practice itself. In a few minutes, once we've gone through the slides, I'm going to actually take you through the meditation. There's also an audio file in the ABT folder for week 5, so I would encourage you to go to that folder. If you can't find it, please contact me by email and I'll direct you to it. But you will be able to find the links to this folder through the WorkVivo lists, or as I said, you can contact me. But I just wanted to describe the basic mechanics of this meditation practice, which is called loving kindness meditation. And the idea is that we do this intermittently to try and generate and cultivate compassion in our minds and our brains so that we can deal with life better, especially life under a global pandemic. So when we go through this meditation, I will describe how you need to imagine yourself standing on a stage. And as you're standing on a stage, you try to conjure up 3 groups of people in front of you. So the group on the left will be those you love. So your close family members, your friends, and maybe people who've passed away, but essentially people that you have a very strong, positive emotional connection with, those you love. And you imagine these individuals and their faces in as much detail as you can. Again, you'll have your eyes closed and I will take you through this meditation when we get to it. And in your mind, you smile toward them and observe them smiling back to you. And you say in your mind, I wish you health and happiness. And as you're picturing these loved ones, you really try and cultivate and generate this positive emotion of love. And sometimes this can be a little overwhelming and you might shed a tear depending on how emotional you are at the time. But I really want you to try and conjure up and feel this positive emotion as you're engaging this compassion and you're wishing these loved ones health and happiness. So we spend a minute or 2 with that group on the left as you're standing on the stage looking down on these individuals. And then we conjure up a group in the middle. And this group of people in the middle are people that we're by and large neutral toward. So we neither love these people or hate these people. We're neutral. We have no positive or negative emotions toward them, but we don't wish them harm. And these individuals are usually your baker, your news agent, your bus driver, for example, people you might meet on the street as you're walking to work in the morning. You may not know their names, but you recognize their face. So I want you to, when we practice this ultimately, I want you to picture a number of these individuals. If you can, try and picture their faces. Again, you're relatively neutral toward these people, but you don't wish them any harm, obviously. And I want you to try in this practice eventually to try and conjure up the same type of emotion that you felt for the loved ones. You're trying to transfer this emotion toward this group of people that you're largely neutral toward. And again, you imagine yourself smiling toward them in your mind's eye, and they smile back toward you. And just like before with your loved ones, you wish this group in the center health and happiness. And you imagine the feeling coming back from them as well. Now, you might not naturally feel really a genuine feeling of love for these individuals, but you do your best to act as if you do. And you go through the motions of this anyway. And this is important to remember, that you act as if, even though you can't generate quite the intensity of emotion, you try your best to do it anyway, and you still say the phrase, I wish you health and happiness. Now we move towards a group on the right. And the group on the right is usually more difficult to deal with. And for some people, we might not even want to veer toward this group on the right. Maybe you're lucky, maybe there are no enemies in your life, and maybe you love and appreciate everybody. But for many people, there are individuals who irritate them, or who even more than irritate them, who fall into really the hateful group. Hopefully this isn't you, but if it is, this is the group that we're talking about at the moment. You might call these people your enemies. Enemy is really a perception, and we're going to try and soften that with this type of practice. So with the group on the right, these are people that you usually have negative emotions toward, or they cause negative emotions in you. So it might be a difficult individual at work, for example. So just as we've done for the first two groups on the left and in the center, we want to try and conjure up some semblance of the emotions you had for the group on the left to this group on the right. Now, I'm sure you're thinking that it would be absolutely impossible to recreate the feeling of love that you'd have for the group on the left as you do on the right. But again, just as with the group in the center, I need you to go through the emotions in this meditation practice and act as if. I need you to smile even though your mind will be telling you not to. I need you to picture these individuals and their faces, and I need you to imagine them smiling back at you. And I want you to wish these individuals health and happiness. Again, it might be counterintuitive for you to act like this. Your brain might be screaming at you not to, but I want you to go through the motions anyway. So now these are three groups in front of you. Again, the goal here is to try and generate a compassion, moving from intense positivity, let's say, over towards a less positive group, towards a negative group. And we're trying to transfer some kind of positive emotion over to these groups. Usually at the end of this meditation, we end with the self. In other words, me or you, the person who's meditating. And believe it or not, for many people, this can actually be the most difficult part of this meditation. And during the last phase of the meditation, you conjure up your own face. And you do this in as much detail as you can. And you imagine you smiling at you and back again. And you wish yourself health and happiness. And you try and transfer the love and emotion and positive emotion you feel for the group on the left toward yourself. Now, this is a useful litmus test to see how you're actually feeling about yourself at the time. And if you remember a lot of the sources of self-criticism and self-judgment that we described last week, this is where you might find this self-criticism living. So I would encourage you to engage in this practice at the very end of this meditation practice. In other words, with you at the focus, you try and transfer this positive emotion and love, and you wish yourself health and happiness. So the circle is now complete. We move from you on the stage, observing the individual on the left that you love, the ones in the middle that you're neutral toward, the ones on the right that you're negative toward or generate negative emotions in you, and finally you rest with yourself and your own face. So this is the meditation in total. It can be as long or as short as you want, and we will practice it at the end of today's session. So I hope that all makes sense for you. So I just want to very briefly go through some of the science that's out there in terms of compassion and the impact it can have on the body and the mind. And I'm really just going to focus on one paper at the moment. There are a lot of papers out there. This I find personally is a quite good one. And it focuses on the neuroscience of compassion and the impact of the loving kindness meditation that I just described to you on the brain and different brain structures. And again, as always, we have the reference at the bottom here, so you can go in and see that at your leisure. It should also be in the manual in the ABT folder for week 5. I should stress, I'm an immunologist and a psychotherapist. I am in no way a neuroscientist. So if you are a neuroscientist watching this, I apologize for my lack of expertise in this area. And I'm not going to delve into too much detail. I just want to give you a basic overview of what this paper and this research group are looking at. So essentially, they recruited 2 groups of individuals. So one group are 16 novice meditators. So individuals, perhaps like many of you, who have just been introduced to meditative-like practices and just started a number of weeks, or even just for a week by itself. And this group was compared to 16 long-term meditators. So these are expert meditators who have been meditating for longer than 10 years. They're quite used to it, to engage it on a daily basis, and they know how to do it. These are experts. So both these groups were collected and brought in by the researchers, and they were encouraged to engage in the loving kindness meditation that I just described to you in the laboratory. And during this practice, they were exposed to 3 different types of audio sounds. They were wearing headphones, as you can see here. So they were exposed to a neutral sound, a positive sound, which was a baby laughing, and what they perceived as a negative sound, which was a woman crying. So again, 3 different sounds, 1 neutral, 1 positive, and 1 negative. And during this time, their brains were being scanned by a magnetic resonant imaging machine, so a functional one here, fMRI, and their brains were scanned for looking at different activities and changes in different centers of the brain. So again, you can go into much more detail in this resource here that you can look into at your leisure after this session. And I'm just going to focus on one tiny bit of this because, as I said, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I just want to give you a basic overview. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to understand this. And I want to show you that many parts of the brain actually were changed in response to this type of loving kindness meditation as measured by an MRI scanner. And I'm just going to focus on one area of the brain that was changed here, and it's called the insula. And you can see here from the, excuse me, from the bottom, that the insula plays a significant function in the brain in terms of pain reception and perception, social engagement, but also empathy and emotional regulation. And what I want you to show you here is that this is just an example of the brain of one of the expert meditators. Again, we'll be able to see the left and the right hemispheres here. And you'll see that this area that's highlighted here is actually insula. So that's the part of the brain that I've just described here at the bottom. So again, it has many functions. One of them is the generation of empathy and compassion. So this graph here represents what's happening in this area of the brain for both the expert and the novice meditators. And what I want you to show you here is that you see a significant increase in the activity of this part of the brain, according to these researchers. This is in response to the negative sound and the positive sound. So the negative being a woman crying, the positive being a baby laughing. And what you can see is that the expert meditators have a significant increase in the signal change in this area in the brain. While you can see in the novice meditators, there was actually a reduction in activity in response to the negative sound and a slight maybe increase from the baseline in terms of the positive sound. So again, we don't need to be neuroscientists here to understand what's happening here. We can see that the expert meditators seem to be able to regulate emotion in this area that's responsible for, among many other things, empathy, and generate compassion to a greater extent using this and during this loving kindness meditation. So I hope that makes sense, and you can get more information by clicking on the link below. So this is one other area I just want to describe, and you might remember from week 1 that I showed you some small amount of research that colleagues that I was working with in Trinity College and the Royal College of Physicians in Ireland at the time in St James's Hospital, where we looked at burnout among healthcare professionals, specifically members of the emergency department. And through our research at this time and from reading literature around the world in this area, we found that really burnout was a significant problem in terms of healthcare professionals. And burnout is largely described as comprising of 3 different components, according to this questionnaire that's used throughout the world as a validated survey instrument. And you can see that burnout usually forms 3 different significant components. So burnout is related to emotional exhaustion, which speaks for itself. So during burnout, individuals have an increase in emotional exhaustion. And then there's also an increase in what's called depersonalization. And you can see here that depersonalization is all about compassion. And an increase in depersonalization, particularly among healthcare professionals, is associated with reduced compassion for the self to begin with. So the self-critic begins to emerge. The individual becomes less compassionate towards colleagues and management in their field of work and where they're working. And crucially then, a decreased compassion towards patients. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this will have a significant knock-on effect, not just for the individual healthcare provider, but also for the patients and colleagues and the system as a whole. So I just want to remind you again of this work that we did with colleagues in Trinity College and the Royal College of Physicians in Ireland. And we also have found, which many other researchers around the world which have found, that 1/3 of the emergency department group in St. James's Hospital at this time that we were looking at, so we were looking at 42 members at this point, which was roughly 1/3 of the entire emergency department. And you can see here that in terms of depersonalization, which is compassion, there was a 1/3 increase in depersonalization. So in other words, this depersonalization, which is a decrease in compassion, was increased in 1/3 of the individuals that we were looking at in the emergency department. And this was specifically higher and particularly higher for those in the medical group, so the doctors within this group. So you can see that this is really an important part of healthcare provision, and especially for those who are burnt out. And we would suggest that if you can engage something like loving kindness meditation in association with attention-based training that we described during this course, that we might be able to manage burnout in a better way and reduce the depersonalization and increase the compassion in this cohort. So this is something that we'll be interested in future research, and I would imagine other researchers around the world are actively looking at it. So it's just to bring it into context in terms of healthcare provision, which I'm sure many of you will be connected to or are actually watching this course at the moment. Another really important website out there, if you're genuinely interested in this area of compassion and altruism, is the Stanford Center for Compassion, Altruism Research and Education. And this is led by Professor Barbara Fredrickson, who really is a global leader in this field in terms of very significant world-beating research on compassion, and not just the impact on the brain, but the impact on the body as a whole, on behavior, psychology, and sociology. So if you're interested in this field, this is a really good one-stop shop for all the research being conducted at the moment. And Professor Fredrickson, as I said, is a global leader here. So I would encourage you to go onto this site and have a look at some of the research they're doing here on compassion. Okay, so let's get down to the basics of it, the actual practice itself. I know at this stage, normally towards the end of the session, we would practice a 2-minute core attention-based training practice. But in this session, I think we'll engage in another satellite practice, which is the loving kindness meditation that I described at the start. So again, we adopt the usual posture, upright posture, but not rigid as usual. Feet planted firmly on the ground. Again, your hands resting in your lap or comfortably by your side. And then you gently close your eyes. Remember to continue to breathe as normal throughout this practice as I'm guiding you through it. And if you do become distracted, remember you just return to my voice as I'm guiding you through it, rather than an anchor that you usually would associate with in terms of disengagement. So I want you to take one deep inhalation. And then a slow exhalation. And I want you to picture yourself sitting on a stage. And as you sit on this stage, I want you to imagine a group sitting down in the seats on the left, sitting down below you on the left. And the individuals sitting here are those that you love the most. They may be family members, they may be friends, they may be past loved ones. And if you can, I want you to conjure up their faces in as much detail as you can. And I'd like you to imagine that they're smiling back up at you. And you're smiling down at them. Try to conjure up the feeling of love and positive emotion that you have for these individuals. Really try and feel it. And as you're watching these individuals, I want you to wish them health and happiness. So you can say that in our mind's eye. I wish you health and happiness. Imagine the detail of their faces. Really try and feel the emotion here for these individuals. And now I want you to imagine a different type of group of individuals sitting right in front of you. And these individuals are perhaps acquaintances, as I mentioned before, maybe a newsagent, your bus driver, a neighbor that you're not too familiar with. If you can, try and conjure up one of their faces in as much detail as you can as they sit in front of you. Try and develop some of the positive emotion that you felt from the group on the left with this group in front of you. Imagine them smiling up at you and you smiling down at them. Try and feel this positive emotion going between the two of you. And I want you to wish them health and happiness. So really try and get a sense of this positive emotion between the two of you as you smile down and they smile back up, as you wish them health and happiness. And now we move to a group on the right. And in this group, we have individuals that we may not like. They might be our enemies. They might elicit negative emotions in us when we meet them. If you can, I want you to try and imagine their faces, or at least one of their faces, in as much detail as you can. Try to ignore any chattering by your brain. You might not want to engage with these individuals, but do it anyway. I want you to smile down at these individuals and imagine them smiling genuinely back up at you. And as hard as it might be, I want you to try and transfer some of the emotion that you've had for the ones you love over to this group. And do your best to try and let this emotion flow into this individual or group of individuals as you genuinely smile toward them and they smile back at you. And whether you feel like it or not, act as if you do have positive emotions toward them. And wish them health and happiness. Do your best to engender positive emotion here. And finally, as we move away from this group, and as you sit on this imaginary stage, I want you to try and picture your own face in front of you in as much detail as you can. I want you to smile at your own face genuinely and imagine your face smiling back at you. Try to engender the same positive emotion for your own self as you have for loved ones. And wish yourself health and happiness. Really try and transfer this positive emotion here. So just for 20 seconds or so at the end of this meditation, I just want you to engage the core practice. Just continue to breathe normally. Choose your anchor. Sit as you are, just simply being and breathing, just for 20 seconds. So now that we're finished this loving kindness, compassion-based meditation, you can open your eyes. Maybe have a little stretch just to bring yourself back into the room. And before we finish, I'm going to remind you that the goal for this week is the giant number 6. So 6 minutes of your core practice. And that's your core practice morning and evening. And sometimes when I'm with small groups of patients or individuals, it's around the week 4 or 5 that people tell me that they would like to actually practice for longer. And is this okay? And this is absolutely okay. Now, I know some of you may not even have reached 6 yet, and that's fine. That's okay too. But if you have a feeling that you'd like to practice longer than 6 minutes, that maybe you're naturally going over 6 and you're reaching into 10, for example, that's perfectly fine. You move now for as long as you want as you're getting used to this practice. 6 is a guide. 6 is a target. I would hope that many of you or most of you are reaching 6. If you're not, that's okay. But if you do feel like you'd want to go beyond 6, then please do. Absolutely no harm in doing that. So in terms of the tips for this week then, as ever, if you're having difficulty practicing during the week, we don't want to let that slide. So you need to sit down and give some thought to this and look at your practice regimens. Maybe there's something that's out of place. Try to identify the barriers that were stopping you practice this week and try and put in something that makes that barrier drop a little so that your practice gets easier. Just to remind you that the attention-based training, where we disengage moment by moment using an anchor, the breath or a chosen phrase, is the core practice that we bookend in the morning and the evening of the day. And we use these satellite practices such as the body scan, urge surfing, and now this new practice, which is loving kindness, compassion-based meditation, as satellites around this core practice, and we use them as need be. For this week, though, I would like you to try and see if there are some times during the week where you can actually practice this meditation by yourself. So you can do it guided from the audio file that's in the folder, or you can just look at the slide and develop your own version of it. But I would encourage you to try and insert it into the week. It's very useful if you're a healthcare worker and you're experiencing some level of burnout, or if you're having difficulties with individuals in work or at home or in families, for example, or just genuinely, it's a good practice to develop compassion, and it's no harm for all of us, including me. I'm going to remind you again that there's no such thing as a good or bad practice. It's all good. We don't judge, we just practice, and our timer goes off and we get on with the rest of our day. And remember, the core practice is disengagement from thoughts, memories, emotions, and sensations that we cannot stop. We simply disengage from these aspects of our biology. And each time we become distracted, you return to your anchor, which now will be either the breath or a chosen phrase, I am here now. So thank you very much for tuning in today. I hope you got something from the compassion-based practices. I will return to the Q&A session now, and I'll just have a quick search through the chat area. If there's no questions there, then we'll leave it at that for today. And as usual, if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me through the WorkVivo accounts or directly through my RCSI email. So I'm just going to quickly go on to the chat component here just to see if there's any questions, which I don't think there are. No, I don't see.
Pork, there was one from Amanda. She was asking, can you use 2 different anchors in the same meditation?
Oh, right. I'm not seeing those at all.
That
Jane.
one was published. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. No problem. Let me just try and have a look at them here. Yeah, I can't really see them. Anyway, yeah. So Amanda was asking the question: can you use 2 different types of anchors in the same practice?
Correct.
Yeah. So generally, for me, I think it's better just to pick one anchor and go with that for the whole duration of all your practices. You know, I think if we flip-flop between different anchors, especially for the core practice, we have a tendency to flip-flop, and the practice doesn't usually set in stone. You know. So for me, it's better to pick one. Now, look, if it does feel more comfortable to flip-flop and it's not interfering with you practicing on a daily basis, that's okay. But generally, I would recommend that you pick one over the other.
Park, I did have a question, just jumping in my power as a moderator here. If so, as part of the compassion meditation practice, I would struggle to visualize people and things. Have you got any advice around that?
Yep, thanks for that, Ruth. That's a really common and important question. So for some people, their brains aren't visually oriented, that's one aspect of it. For others, they genuinely find it hard to visualize their own faces, for example. And then for other people, they find it hard to visualize people in general. So I think, you know, if you think about someone you love and you can't visualize their face in all its detail, you can still get a sense of that individual. And the same for people that might be in the negative camp. Usually I find when people can't picture their own faces, there's usually something about the self-critic there that emerges, but we're not going to go into a psychotherapeutic session. But I would say that if you're one of the type of individuals whose brain naturally doesn't revolve around imaging and can't form, you know, definitive details of a face, I wouldn't worry too much about that. As long as you have the sense of the individual, that should be okay. I hope that answers your question.
That's great, thank you.
No problem. So I can't see any questions at all, Jane. Is that pretty much it? Or?
There's one more. Oh, you know, Amanda's just saying thank you. Yeah,
okay.
That's it.
No problem at all. Okay, so that's great. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll chat with you next week.